In January 1981, a 97-year-old woman fell asleep in a bedroom at Kensington Palace and never opened her eyes again. Her name, Alice. On the morning she first cried out at Windsor Castle in February 1883, her grandmother governed the largest empire the planet ever assembled, roughly a quarter of the globe shaded in imperial pink, and that grandmother answered to the name Queen Victoria. By the time Alice stopped breathing, the empire survived only as a scatter of small islands. Astronauts crossed the surface of the moon and came home again, and just one of Victoria's grandchildren still drew breath anywhere on the planet. That grandchild, Alice. Every cousin and sibling from those Windsor nurseries lay in the ground ahead of her. Here is Kensington Palace, and I'd like you to actually sit with how warped that timeline runs. A single human life, draped across the gap between a queen born before the first photograph and a country that watched the old woman's funeral in color on the evening news. Alice took in the whole sweep of it. She also lowered 2 of her 3 children into graves, carried a disease in her bloodstream she did nothing to deserve, and burned through the back half of her life, politely declining to mention that her favorite brother spent years marching around Germany in a Nazi uniform. Alice arrived on February 25, 1883, in a bedroom at Windsor Castle, the first child of Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, who happened to rank as the youngest son Queen Victoria ever produced. Her mother, Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont, a sharp and capable German princess, joined the British royal family by marriage 2 years earlier. For a few short months, the little family looked like a fairy tale. Then, spring of 1884 arrived and slammed the book shut because Leopold's body betrayed him from birth. He bled. Leopold carried hemophilia, the clotting disorder that ran like a fault line under the surface of Victoria's descendants, and a bruise another man would shrug off could pin Leopold to a bed for weeks. In late March he traveled to Cannes on the French Riviera, partly for his health and partly to dodge the damp English winter his doctors swore would kill him. He slipped on a staircase at a club there and cracked his knee and his head. For most people that means an ice pack and an embarrassing story. In Leopold's body it triggered a cerebral hemorrhage, his brain bleeding inside a skull that could not stop it, and on March 28, 1884, he died in France at the age of 30. His daughter was just 13 months old. She would never carry a single real memory of the man, only the second-hand portrait other people painted for her years later, all of it filtered through her mother's grief and the careful storytelling of a royal household that preferred its dead princes noble and uncomplicated. Decades on, in a memoir she wrote in her 80s called For My Grandchildren, Alice reached back toward those earliest years and the shadow her father's death threw over the household. Historians read that book gently, the way you'd read anyone's account of a time too early to truly remember. One fact stays solid. Alice grew up fatherless, and the cause sat in her own blood. Whether she understood it yet or not, the man in the portraits over the mantel having handed her a fate before she could walk. Let me explain the curse properly, because it shaped nearly everyone Alice ever loved, and you can't understand a single grave in this story without it. Hemophilia keeps blood from clotting the way it should, so a wound that would scab over in a normal body keeps seeping. Sometimes on the outside, sometimes deep inside, sometimes for days. The gene that carries it sits on the X chromosome, and that location explains the whole reason it behaves the way it does across a family tree. Men, with their single X, either carry the disorder or escape it. Women hold 2 X chromosomes, so they usually keep a healthy copy to cover for the broken one and rarely suffer the bleeding themselves. Yet they can hand the faulty gene straight down to their kids without ever showing a symptom. For a long time, people assumed this thing crept into the royal line from somewhere ancient. Modern genetics tells a different story. The mutation appears to have started fresh, right inside Queen Victoria herself. Victoria, patient zero. From her body it spread out into the royal houses of Britain, Germany, Russia, and Spain, threading through arranged marriage after arranged marriage until half the crowned heads of Europe shared a flaw none of them could see. Follow the worst branch and you reach Russia. Victoria's granddaughter Alex married Tsar Nicholas II, carried the gene across the border, and passed it to her only son, the boy meant to inherit the largest land empire on the planet. Tsarevich Alexei bled. His desperate parents pulled a wandering holy man named Rasputin into the palace because the man seemed able to calm the boy's attacks, and that decision poisoned the monarchy's reputation at the exact moment revolution gathered outside the gates. In 1918, a Bolshevik firing squad ended the whole family in a basement, and when scientists tested the Romanov remains decades later, they read Victoria's mutation right there in the bones. The same broken gene that orphaned baby Alice helped topple a dynasty across the continent. Spain told a quieter version of the same horror. Victoria's granddaughter Ana married King Alfonso XIII and brought the gene to Madrid, where two of her sons bled, one of them dying after a car accident in a grim rehearsal of the fate already waiting for Alice's own boy. The Spanish court blamed the foreign princess for the tainted blood. The marriage curdled, and the monarchy itself collapsed into exile within a generation. Wherever Victoria's daughters and granddaughters carried it, the curse ran the same cruel script, killing the sons while their carrier sisters passed it on untouched, and quietly hollowing out one royal house after another. Now run it down to Alice herself. Her father Leopold carried the full disorder, the kind that bled him through a short life and killed him at 30. A daughter of a hemophiliac father leaves nothing to chance, which is why geneticists call her an obligate carrier. She inherits her father's only X chromosome, which carries the flaw without exception. Alice never bled the way Leopold did. She carried the thing silently, a loaded weapon she would pass to her children on a coin flip, and 3 coin flips waited just ahead of her. With Leopold gone, his widow Helena faced a problem common to royal widows of the era, namely that her entire financial existence now depended on the goodwill and the purse of Queen Victoria. The grand life Leopold might have provided evaporated the moment he died. Helena and her 2 small children, Alice and a son born 4 months after his father's death, and christened Charles Edward, settled into Claremont House in Surrey, a handsome but hushed country home that ran on a tighter budget and a quieter rhythm than the palaces Alice's cousins romped through. When I filmed in Surrey, you can still see the grounds where that childhood played out, green and orderly, and a little melancholy around the edges. Alice grew up here as a poor relation in a very wealthy family, close enough to the throne to feel its gravity, far enough from the money to notice the difference every single day. Nobody neglected her, though. Victoria kept a fond and watchful eye on the fatherless grandchildren, summoning them to Windsor and Balmoral and Osborne, so Alice spent chunks of her youth orbiting the old queen at close range, soaking up the manners and the iron sense of duty that would define her for the next 90 years. That upbringing carved grooves you can trace through the rest of her life, a woman who wore restraint like a second skin and treated self-pity as a kind of bad manners. She would need every ounce of it. The losses stacking up in her future would have flattened a softer person, and Claremont, for all its quiet sadness, built something in her that simply refused to flatten. A shy girl in plain dresses learned early that grief gets carried in silence, and that duty fills the hours grief would otherwise eat. In February 1904, Alice married Prince Alexander of Teck, and to grasp why that counts as a slightly funny sentence, you need to know where the Tecks sat. Not quite at the top table. The Teck family sprang from a morganatic marriage, a royal duke who married a woman beneath his rank, which left them carrying princely titles while perpetually short of cash, and a notch below the fully royal. Alexander's sister, Princess Mary of Teck, climbed clean out of that semi-royal limbo by marrying the future George V and turning into the Queen Mary history remembers, the formidable consort who ran the royal household like a drill sergeant in pearls. So, when Alice married Alexander, she married the brother of the next queen, the brother-in-law of the man about to run the British Empire, folding herself even tighter into the family she grew up at the edge of. Alexander, known in the family as Auge, soldiered for a living, a cavalry officer with a steady temperament and none of the drama that haunted the louder branches of European royalty. The match worked. By the standards of arranged-ish royal marriages, where relatives nudge two people together and then ask them to build a life from scratch, Alice and Alexander genuinely liked each other, and they would stay married for nearly 50 solid years until his death in 1957. Durability like that broke the norm in their world, and it handed Alice the one stable thing she could lean on while everything else in her life kept catching fire. Photographs from the wedding show a composed young woman in white, ringed by the largest gathering of crowned and titled relatives the era could muster. Cousins poured in from half the courts of Europe. Royal Europe still functioned then as one enormous quarrelsome family, stitched together by marriages exactly like this one, and not a soul in those photographs guessed the same family would spend the next 40 years tearing itself apart across 2 world wars. Alice married into the system at its glittering height and lived long enough to watch most of it burn down. They started a family quickly, the way the era expected royal couples to. 3 children, born between 1906 and 1910. And here, because of the loaded gene sitting quietly in Alice's chromosomes and the 50-50 odds it forced on every single birth, the arithmetic of the curse finally comes due for the woman carrying it. Their eldest, a daughter named Princess May of Teck, arrived in 1906, carrying the name of her famous aunt. May drew the lucky card. She did not inherit the hemophilia mutation, and we know this with confidence because the disorder never once surfaced in her children or her grandchildren, the kind of clean genetic all-clear that only reveals itself generations down the road. May grew up, married a Royal Horse Guards officer, became Lady May Cambridge and later Lady May Abel Smith, raised children of her own, and lived a long, full life all the way into 1994, outlasting nearly everyone else in this story. 1 out of 3 safe. The second child cashed in the worst possible draw. Prince Rupert of Teck, born in 1907 and later styled Viscount Tremeton, inherited the disorder from his mother, which means Alice did to Rupert exactly what Victoria did to Leopold, passing down a silent death sentence through no fault and no warning of her own. Rupert grew into a bright, likable young man who needed to wrap his entire life in caution, because for a hemophiliac in the early 20th century no real treatment existed, only the grim standing instruction to never, ever suffer a serious injury. No rough sports and no real risks for him, just a whole boyhood spent watching other boys do the ordinary reckless things boys do. In 1928, at the age of 20, Rupert suffered exactly the injury everyone dreaded. He rode in a car in France when it crashed, fracturing his skull, and in a man with normal blood that counts as a serious wound you might well survive. Inside Rupert's body it turned unsurvivable. The bleeding inside his skull would not stop. The doctors could only stand at the bedside and watch it unfold, and on April 15, 1928, after roughly 2 weeks during which his mother almost certainly knew exactly how this would end, Rupert died. That leaves the third child, and the third child marks where the history turns murky. Prince Maurice of Teck arrived in 1910 and lived only about 5 months before dying that same year. Popular accounts often slot Maurice neatly into the hemophilia story. A second son, a second victim, tidy and tragic. The documents don't actually support that. Contemporary records list nothing more than a vague infantile illness as the cause, and hemophilia rarely kills an infant who isn't yet crawling and colliding with the world, absent some sharp trauma to trigger it. Maurice's real cause of death resists verification at this distance, so the honest version runs like this. Alice lost a baby at 5 months for reasons history never nailed down, and lost a grown son 2 decades later to a disease history understands all too well. Either way, of 3 children, she would bury 2 before she reached 50. Roll back a few years to the First World War, because something in 1917 changed Alice's name, along with the names of half her relatives. By 1917, Britain neared the end of its 3rd year at war with Germany, and the British royal family nursed a public relations migraine, namely a family drowning in German titles and German surnames, while British boys died in the trenches fighting actual Germans. Mobs smashed the windows of shops with German-sounding names. Respectable families quietly gave up their dachshunds, and the crown suddenly looked dangerously foreign at the worst possible moment, which pushed King George V to fix the optics fast. He issued letters patent ordering the family to drop their German styles, and that single decree rebranded the whole dynasty almost overnight. The royal house took the name Windsor, which it still wears today. Over in another branch, the Battenbergs anglicized into the Mountbattens, a name you'll meet again. Down at Alice's level, her husband Alexander of Teck surrendered his German princely title and reinvented himself as plain Sir Alexander Cambridge, and shortly after the king created him Earl of Athlone. Alice, though, won a special carve-out. By royal warrant, she kept her standing as a princess of the blood royal, so rather than vanishing into a simple Lady Athlone, she emerged as Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, a title that wedged her royal birth and her husband's brand-new earldom into one slightly clunky package. Quick note to save you some confusion, because two royal Alices float around this era and people mix them up constantly. Ours belongs to Queen Victoria as a granddaughter. The other one, Princess Alice of Battenberg, counted as Victoria's great-granddaughter and gave birth to Prince Philip, which puts her a full generation further down the tree. Same first name, but a totally different woman living a totally different life. Keep our Alice filed under granddaughter, last of her kind, and you'll never lose the thread. In 1924, Alexander took up the job of Governor-General of the Union of South Africa, which turned Alice into the vice-regal consort. Basically, the Queen's stand-in for a chunk of the empire sitting several thousand miles south of London. The posting dropped her into one of the trickier political rooms in the whole imperial world. South Africa, in the 1920s, still nursed fresh wounds from the Boer War, only 2 decades gone, and a hard current of Afrikaner nationalism ran against nearly everything the British Crown stood for. A clumsy consort could have inflamed the whole thing with one tone-deaf banquet. Alice handled it better than almost anyone expected. She brought a gift for the vice-regal balancing act, looking every inch the dignified royal while staying warm and approachable enough that people on the ground actually liked her. Touring the country by rail and by car, she opened hospitals and schools, hosted endless receptions, bothered to learn the local tensions instead of steamrolling them, and pulled it off across 6 years without sparking a single diplomatic fire. Her husband's term wrapped up on December 21, 1930, and the couple sailed home with their reputations as imperial representatives in better shape than when they first arrived, which, on that posting, qualified as a genuine win. The voyage alone tells you the scale of the commitment. Reaching South Africa meant weeks at sea each way, a different climate, a different politics, and a household uprooted from London for years at a stretch. Alice ran that household, managed the social calendar of a vice-regal court, and represented a crown that plenty of her hosts resented on sight. A lifetime of royal drilling prepared her for exactly this brand of high-wire courtesy, and the preparation held. Six years after leaving South Africa, Alice found herself near the center of the worst royal crisis in modern British memory. In 1936, King Edward VIII, her cousin, decided he'd rather marry the twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson than keep his throne, and the whole monarchy lurched toward a constitutional cliff. Families splinter in moments like that. People pick sides, loyalties crack under pressure, and the question of who ends up wearing the crown turns relatives into rivals overnight. Alice and Alexander planted themselves firmly on the side of stability. As two of the older, steadier figures in the family, respected precisely because they spent decades doing the unglamorous work of duty, they backed the Duke and Duchess of York, the reluctant couple who would become King George VI and Queen Elizabeth once Edward walked away from it all. Alice's whole worldview ran on a single idea, that you do not put your personal wants above the institution, that the crown outranks whoever happens to wear it on any given morning. Edward's choice offended that worldview right down to the foundation. Alice's younger brother, Charles Edward, carried a story so dark it almost swallows hers whole. Give it room. He arrived in 1884, a few months after their father Leopold died, which rendered him a posthumous child, a baby who entered the world already fatherless and already, though nobody knew it then, marked for one of the strangest fates in the whole family. Raised British, an English-speaking grandson of Queen Victoria, and a pupil at Eton, the boy gave no hint in his first 15 years of where he'd end up. Then, in 1899, the family machinery picked him for a job that would eventually wreck him. The German Duchy of Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha needed an heir, and the family handed Charles Edward, all of 15 years old, the assignment, shipping him off to Germany to learn the language and inherit a throne he never asked for. He took the dukedom in 1900 and swapped his English boyhood for a German one. When the First World War broke out, this grandson of Victoria stood on the German side, fighting against the country of his own birth, which is exactly why Britain stripped him of his British titles under the Titles Deprivation Act in 1919. By then, the boy born at Claremont counted as an enemy alien. Whatever bitterness that produced, the next chapter dwarfs it completely. Through the 1920s and 30s, as Germany cracked apart and a new movement rose out of the wreckage, Charles Edward threw himself behind Adolf Hitler with the zeal of a man hunting for something to belong to. He didn't dabble. Inside a decade, he climbed to the rank of Obergruppenführer in the SA, a senior posting in the Nazi paramilitary, and presided over the German Red Cross during a stretch when its neutrality curdled into a sick joke. A grandson of Queen Victoria, Alice's own brother, wore the uniform of the Third Reich and lent his royal pedigree to the regime's respectability. One thing complicates the easy version. A man of his pedigree handing Hitler a veneer of old-world legitimacy did real damage, the quiet kind that never shows up in a casualty count. Whatever sympathy his sister kept for him, Alice's brother played no passive bystander to the century's worst crime. He pitched in. While her brother served the Nazis, Alice spent the Second World War serving the other side. The contrast could not run starker. In 1940, with Britain fighting flat out for survival, Alexander took on a fresh posting as Governor-General of Canada, and once again Alice became the vice-regal consort, this time in a country pouring its young men into the war against the very regime her brother wore a uniform for. The job demanded far more than ribbon-cutting. Alice Criss crossed wartime Canada to visit troops and champion the new women's military services, a cause that still raised eyebrows at a moment when the Dominion needed reminding why it bled for a country an ocean away. A royal face at a recruiting drive moved real numbers in 1942, and Alice understood the arithmetic of morale as well as any general in the field. She turned up, again and again, in the plain uniform of duty she carried since childhood. The Athlones lived at the Citadel of Quebec, the old star-shaped fortress glaring out over the Street Lawrence. In 1943, and again in 1944, that fortress hosted two of the war's top-level summits, the Quebec Conferences, where Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King hammered out Allied strategy face-to-face. The 1943 meeting helped shape the plan for the invasion of occupied Europe, the operation the world would later know as D-Day. Alice ran the household that hosted all of it. By then, the poised hostess who learned her craft in 1920s South Africa arranged the rooms and poured the tea, while the men steering the war plotted the destruction of the regime her brother served. Nobody scripted that. History dealt it to two children of the same dead duke and cast one of them as a host of the Allied war effort, the other as a casualty in waiting of its victory. When the war ended in 1945, the bill for Charles Edward's choices came due, and it came due hard. American forces took him into custody. The denazification courts combed his record, classified him among the guilty, fined him heavily enough to gut his finances, and left the former duke broken and impoverished, living in the rubble of the country he gambled everything on. Queen Victoria's grandson finished the war as a disgraced ex-Nazi, watched by occupying troops, stripped of his standing on every side at once. And in 1946, Alice did something that set a lot of people back in London wincing. she and Alexander packed their bags and traveled to occupied Germany to see him, to visit Charlie, the brother who spent 12 years serving Hitler, while the ashes of his war still smoldered and a Britain still on rationing reeled at what the liberated camps revealed. Pulling royal strings to arrange a trip like that, to a man like that, in a year like that, struck the diplomatic world as wildly tone-deaf. So let me handle this carefully and fairly, the way the history demands. No evidence survives, none, in British intelligence files or the royal archives, that Alice ever shared her brother's politics or carried a flicker of fascist sympathy of her own. Royal historians who've combed the record land in the same spot every time. Her loyalty ran as the loyalty of a sister, not a believer. She crossed because Charlie remained her brother, the posthumous baby she grew up beside at Claremont, and because some part of her apparently refused to write off the boy even after the man committed the unforgivable. Whether you call that loyalty or call it blindness depends on where you stand. The official papers never recorded how Alice squared the affection with the atrocity inside her own head, so we hold only the act itself. She boarded a boat, crossed to a ruined Germany, and traveled to comfort one of the most compromised men in her entire family. He would die in 1954, sick and near penniless, his royal blood worth nothing against his record. You'd forgive a woman in her late 60s, having buried 2 children and weathered a Nazi in the family, for easing quietly into retirement. Alice did the opposite. In 1950, she accepted the post of first Chancellor of the new University College of the West Indies, the institution that grew into the University of the West Indies, and she flatly refused to treat it as a ceremonial trinket to wear to garden parties. She worked it. Alice sailed and flew out to the Caribbean again and again, raised money for the young university, pushed higher education across the Commonwealth, busy shedding the empire she once represented, and held the role for 21 straight years. A woman born into Queen Victoria's own court now handed out degrees to young people in the post-war Caribbean, and she stuck with it until nearly 90. That stretch tells you something the rest of the tragedy can easily bury, which is that Alice never played, at her core, a passive victim of her own bloodline. The losses came for her, over and over, and she absorbed every one. Then she returned to work, because the alternative meant sitting still inside her grief, and sitting still never suited the way she ran things. The loneliness of living too long crept up on her now. One by one, the cousins and siblings from those Victorian nurseries died off, the great-grandchildren of empire thinning out year after year, until the family tree she grew up inside carried almost no leaves at her own level. In April 1969, Queen Victoria, Eugenie of Spain, passed away, another granddaughter of the old queen, the one who carried the bleeding gene into the Spanish royal house and watched it haunt her own sons. With that single death, Alice became the last one alive, the sole surviving grandchild of Queen Victoria anywhere on Earth. Outliving, everyone exacts a strange tax. The friends who shared your jokes and the relatives who stood at your wedding go quiet one by one until you find yourself explaining your own past to strangers who weren't alive for any of it. Alice spent her final decade as the only person on the planet who remembered sitting in a room with Queen Victoria. That rendered her precious to historians, and lonely as a plain fact of daily life. Alice outlasted the reigns of 6 British sovereigns, from her grandmother straight down to Elizabeth II, watching the throne pass through Edward VII, George V, the brief disaster of Edward VIII, George VI, and finally the young queen still wearing the crown today. The empire of her birth decolonized almost entirely around her. Her world didn't merely change. Someone replaced it brick by brick while she stayed standing in the middle as the last living witness to the version that came before. She spent her final years at Kensington Palace, sharp and dignified to the very end, a living relic of a vanished century who still answered her own door and still remembered the dead by their first names. Then, on January 3, 1981, the long life stopped. Princess Alice died in her sleep there at 97, closing a span that opened at Windsor Castle in her grandmother's reign and ended in a Britain that watched men walk on the moon. The last grandchild of Queen Victoria slipped away, and with her vanished the final direct human link to the world the old queen once ruled. Alice took the upbringing Claremont handed her, all that restraint and duty drilled into a fatherless girl, and spent 97 years refusing to fold under losses that would have folded almost anyone alive. The tragedy holds. Her endurance holds just as firmly, and it remains the part history keeps forgetting to mention. So that's Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, the last grandchild of Queen Victoria, a woman who watched her whole world die and kept rising anyway. Tell the people standing around that Windsor cradle in 1883 that this baby would still draw breath when Concorde carried passengers across the Atlantic, and they'd have laughed you out of the castle. She reached that far. Then she closed her eyes at Kensington Palace and quietly took the 19th century with her. Which of Victoria's other descendants should I dig into next? Drop a name in the comments, because this family keeps throwing up stories like this one, and I'm nowhere near finished dragging its stranger corners into the light. Thanks for watching.